stop. Before you scroll past this, before you assume this is just another war headline, just another dramatic thumbnail, just another update in a region the world has been watching in shock for weeks, stop and ask yourself one question. What happens when a country can still intercept most of the missiles coming at it, but not all of them? What happens when the sirens keep going off, the shelters keep filling up, the fires keep appearing on camera, and the public is told the system is holding? Even as more and more people start asking the same dangerous question, holding for how long? Because that is where this story gets real, not in the headline, not in the hype, in the gap between what people are being told and what repeated strikes on Tel Aviv, Haifa, and other Israeli cities are forcing them to feel. And that gap is where fear grows. That gap is where confidence starts to crack. That gap is where wars stop looking like clean maps and military briefings and start looking like something much harder to manage. Attrition, pressure, uncertainty, and the possibility that the strongest defenses in the region are being dragged into a test they were never meant to face for this long. Now let's get one thing straight right at the start. There is no reliable evidence that Israel is in total collapse. That is not what the reporting shows. What the reporting does show is dangerous enough on its own. Iranian missile barrages have hit Tel Aviv, Haifa, and other areas. Some strikes have pierced Israeli defenses. Emergency crews have repeatedly responded to impact sites, and a strike in Haifa damaged essential infrastructure connected to a major refinery complex. Reuters photo coverage and AP reporting both show visible destruction and repeated civilian disruption. And that is the real story, because collapse does not begin with a single dramatic moment. It begins with accumulation. One barrage, then another, one interception failure, then another, one damaged site, then another, one more night where the public is told everything is under control, while everybody can see the strain building anyway. That is how systems get tested. That is how confidence erodes. That is how cities that are not collapsing can still begin to feel like they are living on the edge of something much worse. And right now, Tel Aviv and Haifa are two of the clearest symbols of that pressure. Tel Aviv matters because it is more than a city. It is financial center, political signal, national nerve point, and psychological target all at once. Sirens in Tel Aviv do not just interrupt traffic. They interrupt the image of normalcy. Reuters and AP have both shown scenes of people running for cover, emergency responders moving through damaged zones, and civilians emerging from shelters during pauses in the fighting. Haifa matters for a different reason. Haifa is not only a population center, it is also industrial, strategic, and deeply tied to energy infrastructure. Reuters reported in March that an Iranian strike damaged essential electrical infrastructure associated with a refinery complex in Haifa. The company said most production continued and repairs were underway, but the fact that such infrastructure was hit at all tells you what kind of war this has become. That is not symbolic damage. That is strategic messaging, and once a war starts reaching into energy systems, industrial nodes, and major urban centers at the same time, the meaning of every incoming missile changes. It is no longer only about casualties. It becomes about pressure. Pressure on emergency services, pressure on air defenses, pressure on public confidence, pressure on leaders to retaliate, pressure on supply systems, pressure on the idea that this can be sustained indefinitely. Now here is the contradiction no one wants to say out loud. Israel's missile defense system is still one of the most advanced in the world, and yet the very existence of repeated damage tells you something uncomfortable. Even an advanced system is not the same thing as an impenetrable system. Reuters photo coverage from March described Iranian strikes piercing Israel's missile shield, and AP documented damaged sites in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Petah Tikva after later barrages. That does not mean the defenses failed across the board. It means they are being tested by a volume, tempo, and persistence of attack that turns every percentage point of success into a national question. Because people hear most missiles intercepted and think safe. Military planners hear some missiles got through and think something very different. They think about burn rates. They think about inventory. They think about reload timelines. They think about decision speed. They think about what happens if the attacks continue longer than expected. They think about what must be defended first if everything cannot be defended equally. And that is where Haifa and Tel Aviv become more than headlines. They become proof that the battlefield is no longer somewhere else. It is inside the national routine, inside business districts, inside transport patterns, inside energy infrastructure, inside civilian psychology. And once that happens, even a country that remains functional can start to feel as though it is living under siege. Now, to understand why this matters so much, you have to stop looking at these strikes as isolated events. This is not one bad night. This is not one shocking clip going viral. This is a campaign of sustained pressure. Reuters maps and photo coverage show that Iranian retaliatory strikes have reverberated across Israel and the wider region since the war erupted, while AP's reporting confirms multiple Israeli cities have seen emergency response after missile impacts. That pattern matters more than any single explosion. Why? Because wars like this do not have to produce literal collapse to produce strategic instability. Sometimes all they have to do is narrow the margin between confidence and anxiety, narrow the margin between deterrence and depletion, narrow the margin between the system is holding and the system is holding, but at what cost, narrow the margin between routine alerts and public panic. That is what repeated missile pressure does. It compresses options, and when options are compressed, mistakes become more likely. Now imagine what that feels like from the civilian side. You are in Tel Aviv. You hear the siren again. You run again. Maybe the interceptor works. Maybe it does not. Maybe the blast is far away. Maybe it is close enough to shake the building. Maybe you check your phone and see a hit in another district. Maybe you hear officials say things are under control. Maybe you believe them. Maybe you want to believe them. But after enough nights, enough warnings, enough impact videos, enough smoke over familiar neighborhoods, even people in functioning cities begin to live differently. That is how pressure becomes its own weapon. Now look at Haifa through the same lens. Haifa is not being watched only because of the civilians who live there. It is being watched because damage there sends a signal far beyond the city itself. Reuters reported that the strike on the Haifa refinery complex damaged essential infrastructure and caused temporary power outages in parts of the country, even though officials downplayed the wider significance and said restoration could happen within days. But in war, symbolism matters almost as much as function. A refinery hit does not only raise engineering questions, it raises national questions. How many more sites like that can be hit? How often? How quickly can repairs be made? How much redundancy is really there? How much of the country's sense of resilience depends on the public never fully seeing the strain underneath? That is why total collapse is the wrong phrase, but also why the fear behind that phrase is real. People do not use language like collapse because they have carefully studied infrastructure reports. They use it because they are sensing something broader, that the war is reaching deeper, that the defenses are being challenged, that major cities are no longer psychologically distant from the front line, and that the official reassurances may not fully answer the emotional reality people are living through. And that emotional reality matters, because this is not only a military contest, it is a contest of endurance. Iran does not need to destroy Israel to create strategic pressure. It only needs to prove that it can keep forcing Israel to defend, keep forcing Israel to spend, keep forcing Israel to reassure, and keep forcing Israel to live with the possibility that the next barrage may land somewhere even more sensitive. That is what makes repeated strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa so important. Not because they prove Israeli collapse, they do not, but because they prove that Iran can still reach the places that matter most. And once that becomes the pattern, the war changes character. It stops being about whether the opening retaliatory wave happened. It becomes about whether the defender can absorb wave after wave without political, industrial, or psychological overextension. This is where the United States comes into the picture in a serious way. Washington is not just looking at whether Israel can retaliate. It is also looking at whether regional escalation can be contained, whether Allied confidence can be maintained, whether energy markets can stay stable, and whether a war that has already reached into multiple countries starts stretching even further. AP and Reuters reporting on the broader regional fighting, the ceasefire fragility, and the spillover into shipping and neighboring fronts all point to the same reality. This is not a local military problem anymore. And that means every fire in Tel Aviv, every damaged site in Haifa, every new image of emergency crews in hard hats and smoke becomes part of a much larger calculation, not just for Israel, for Washington, for Tehran, for regional actors, for markets, for anyone trying to figure out whether this conflict is being contained or merely managed until the next rupture. Now here is the harder truth A country can stay standing and still be under enormous pressure. A defense system can keep working and still be under major strain. A city can remain functional and still feel traumatized. And a government can project strength while privately worrying about what happens if this goes on longer than planned. That is the phase this war appears to be entering. Not cinematic collapse, something more complicated, something slower, something more dangerous in its own way. A grinding contest where the question is not, has Israel fallen? It has not. The question is, how much more of this can be absorbed before the costs, military, industrial, psychological, political, start forcing decisions nobody really wants to make? Because that is what Tel Aviv and Haifa are now representing, not the end. The warning before the end, the evidence that the pressure is real, the evidence that defenses, while formidable, are not perfect, the evidence that strategic infrastructure can be touched, the evidence that the next phase of this war may be decided less by one spectacular strike and more by the cumulative weight of many. So how long before total collapse? The honest answer is that is the wrong question. The better question is this: how long before repeated pressure creates a different kind of crisis? Not a dramatic overnight collapse, but a sustained narrowing of options, a deeper public fatigue, a harsher military calculus, and a regional war in which even the strongest systems are forced to reveal their limits. Because if you want to understand what the footage from Tel Aviv and Haifa is really showing you, it is not a country that is already broken. It is a country being tested in its cities, tested in its infrastructure, tested in its defenses, tested in its endurance. And wars like this are often decided not at the moment of the first shock, but at the moment when everyone realizes the shocks are not stopping. That is the real danger now. Not whether one headline goes too far, but whether the reality underneath it is moving day by day, closer to a point where the pressure itself becomes harder to survive than any single strike. And if that point comes, it will not announce itself with one word. It will arrive the way it always does. Another siren, another fire, another impact site, another reassurance, another night. And then one day, people will look back and realize the real question was never whether Tel Aviv was burning or Haifa was in ruins. The real question was whether the system beneath them was being exhausted in plain sight. And by the time everyone agreed on the answer, the war may already have changed.